Morning all. I'm going to have a look at a few games where the King's Gambit was used to defeat world champions. And the first game I'd like to choose was Rudolf Rejo Charousek defeating Emmanuel Lasker. And it's interesting actually, Jessica Fisher Queen has done an excellent 4-part series. Please check out her channel to get the background and insights about Rudolf Charousek. It's a very interesting character in the history of the game who unfortunately he died tragically from tuberculosis at a very young age, 27 I believe. Anyway, in this game he played the King's Gambit. There was also another video, if you want to check out the last round, we had it was his game in that King's Gambit where it was part of a fictional story of an old wise man playing the King's Gambit as white, but that was actually this genius Charousek as well. So Lasker, he accepted the King's Gambit, and some of you may be thinking, is the King's Gambit a viable weapon? We're going to be looking at how world champions lost, and obviously if it can beat world champions, can't be that bad. There's an explosive potential about it. If white can regain the pawn, often the f-file pressure, but also the steps that black sometimes takes to protect this f pawn, leaves these pawns vulnerable. If it's ever regained, if this is undermined, then black is potentially being left with isolated pawns, and that's a key positional idea. In fact, these sliced pawns, if this pawn's knocked out, you end up not with f-file pressure but also loads of other pawns to attack. So there's positional considerations here, and it's also undermining the center. It's like the black's central control. So if white can get in d4 as well, then there's a lot of central control, and black's slippery in the center. There isn't that pawn's knocked out immediately. So anyway, Lasker he did accept the gambit, and now bishop c4 was played. So it's inviting this queen h4 check. So this is an interesting variation. Lasker played d5 first, so he's liberating his queen side bishop immediately, sort of counter gambiting. After bishop takes d5, he plays check, and now he actually does support his pawn with g5. So it's a bit of a risky strategy if this pawn can be knocked out, because I mentioned earlier, if that pawn can be knocked out, then there's going to be pawn weaknesses as well as white dominating in the center. It's like a good way of fracturing black structure using this gambit, for positional trump cards later. So knight f3, the queen moves to h5, and now we see an immediate undermining move actually, h4. But at the moment this rook's not protected, so obviously hg is not threatened at the moment. So bishop g7, which is logical because black's often playing later sometimes with g4 to get the d4 square, and that's a good position for the thin-shattered bishop. So anyway, knight c3 was played, and now c6, so kicking that bishop away, and also it means that this bishop can now come out because that bishop's no longer eyeing b7, so the bishop's now free to come to g4 to pile on the pressure on f3, which piles on the pressure on d4. So it's a fairly logical move, c6. It's not just for the sake of it, it's to get the bishop out now. So bishop g4. Now after d4, Lasker played knight d7. So he's got an idea actually of casting queenside maybe, to put a lot of pressure on the d file, and this queen looks a bit vulnerable. So it looks as if is white's position looking vulnerable. He can't castle. This d pawn is on the d file, and if black castles queenside, it would seem to justify black's early d5 counter gambit. So has everything gone in black's favour so far? Well, this next move actually maybe shows that black's last move was an inaccuracy, because that move knight d7. Now this move king f2 immediately threatens hg. And as pointed out in my Blitz live commentary game, black's got to be very careful about this g5 move, to perhaps play like h6 when they can, like here. Maybe this would be better. So if king f2, there would have been like queen g6 for example. So where hg, you can always recapture that rook with the bishop. So maybe Lasker has actually gone wrong with this knight d7, because the power of king f2 as I mentioned before, you know, if g5 drops off, then we're going to end up with fragmented pawns here. It would fully justify the gambit. You know, white's going to end up winning material later. So bishop takes f3 was played. So against this threat of hg now, because, you know, what else? This is quite an enormous threat now. So maybe Lasker was kicking himself. But anyway, he played bishop f3 and he castled queenside. So I guess, you know, he thought, or maybe, you know, there's enough pressure on d4, and there's tactical ideas like knight e5 or knight c5, you know, exploiting that queen on the d file. Okay, so hg anyway. So we have that situation, that idealistic situation with fragmented pawns now. So queen takes g5, knight e2, immediately hitting f4. And now we see the move queen e7, and Charousek now just supports his d4 pawn. He can take this pawn at leisure. It's very, very vulnerable. Knight e5 was played though. He doesn't mind now giving up this light square bishop. He plays actually queen a4. And you may wonder, well, actually, you know, what about b5? Well, actually, b5 there's check. Queen a6 check doesn't quite work. So, so black, he takes on c4. Lasker takes on c4, and now knight f6. He's going a pawn down. The King's Gambit here has been a positional success. There's these fragmented pawns, and white is actually a pawn up. Ironically, after, you know, trying to be a pawn down straight from the opening, he's now a pawn up, and he's got great pressure on the queen side here at the moment. So queen a4, provoking another weakness. A6, queen a5, threatening mate. Bishop and queen on c7. So knight f8, and now knight g3 coming into that sensitive f5 square. You know, black's position is a bit of a mess here. Knight e6. White can afford to ignore that bishop threat. He can attack the queen. Queen f8. Now bishop g3. So white's got a formidable, you know, winning positioning, but, you know, he's playing against Lasker, who's very resourceful. But even Lasker, you know, he can't save this position. It's very, very difficult. So after rook d7, white actually took that bishop on g7, simplifying things and weakening these dark squares in the process. Because now, like queen e5, it threatens not just the queen but also queen b8 mate. So it's taking more material off. After bishop e5, sorry, queen e5, bishop e5. If the rook moves, then rook h7. So Lasker tries actually f6. So he's going 2 pawns down now by force, but he is defending, because of that f6, the h7 pawn now. So he'd rather keep his h7 pawn. So rook f8. Now perhaps e5 is playable here, unless there's a little trick. But Charousek, he supports it in Charousek. He supports his bishop with rook h6. After knight f4, now the king moves into the centre, and it's a very pleasant position to play. It's 2 pawns down for black here. White's 2 pawns up, and the big centre. It's a total success for the King's Gambit. So one of the main positional ideas, which maybe at the start of this video you didn't appreciate, it's this idea of fragmenting the opponent's pawn structure. You know, the isolated pawn pressure means, you know, there's weaknesses in front like f5. You know, these pawns are just vulnerable to frontal attacks. Anyway, so king d2 was played, and now rook d f7. It's harmless because now e5 just supporting the bishop, and also the pawn as well is threatening e6 in some lines if black's not careful. Black's totally lost. He's going to be run over here because the frontal pressure on this pawn's too much to bear. There's no way of defending h7. So rook a h1. He's going to be like 3 pawns up. Rook g8 with the idea of maybe of some counterplay. But here Charousek actually he plays c4. So he's inviting rook g2, but with the idea of king e3 without allowing knight d5 check. So the c4 is stopping that pesky knight from, you know, coming to d5 to be annoying after rook d2 check, rook g2 check. So knight e6, now he centralizes his king. It's really all over bar the shouting. So knight f8, and now these pawns in the centre turn out to be totally, overwhelming. Just d5. So originally the intention may have been to stop the knight coming to d5, but now we've got a roller coaster in the centre. So d5, rook d7, and after e6, Lasker's had enough. He resigns, and he was so astonished and surprised. Lasker, said, one day I'll be playing a match against this man, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. I'd really, recommend you check out the 4-part series on Charousek at Jessica Fisher Queen's channel.